Welcome everyone to the December Professor's Corner, Opportunity Zones or Reassessment. This program is sponsored by the ABA's Real Property Trust and Estate Law Section's Legal Education and Uniform Law Group. Every month, the group hosts a call that features a panel of professors and practitioners who discuss recent developments and other topics of interest to the practicing bar as well as academics. If you're not yet a member of the RPTE section, we encourage you to join and take advantage of membership benefits like this webinar. The next Professor's Corner after this one will take place on January 10th, 2023, and it's entitled Possibilities and Pitfalls of Mixed-Use Development. I am Professor Andrea Boyack. I will be your moderator today. I teach real estate transactions, property, and related courses at Washburn University School of Law in Topeka, Kansas, where I'm the Norman R. Pozos Chair of Business and Transactional Law. Our panel today brings expert and insight from all angles on the topic of the program, which is opportunity zones created by the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And I'm not going to get into what that is because our panelists will, but let me tell you a little bit about who they are. First, we will hear from Professor Brandon Weiss. He teaches at American University College of Law in Washington, D.C. His research and teaching focus on property law and theory, as well as the relationship between housing and economic mobility and government intervention, with a particular emphasis on federal subsidized housing policy. Professor Weiss currently serves on the executive committees of the property law section, the real estate transaction section, and the community economic development section of the American Association of American Law Schools, AALS. And he previously has taught at UCLA, UMKC, and Yale. Prior to teaching, Professor Weiss practiced law in Los Angeles and was a Skadden Fellow at Public Counsel Law Center, working on the preservation of subsidized housing and at a boutique transactional affordable housing firm. Then we have Professor Rashmi Dhyal-Chand, and her research and teaching focus on property law, poverty, economic development, and consumer law. She has an article that she wrote in 2006, Human Work as Collateral, that won the 2006 Association of American Law Schools Scholarly Papers Competition for New Law Teachers. And since then, she's published many excellent articles in some of the country's top law school journals. Professor Dhyal-Chand has also published 2 books with Cambridge University Press, and prior to joining the law school faculty at Northwestern in 2002, Professor Dhyal-Chand served as an associate general counsel of the Community Builders, Inc., a nonprofit affordable housing developer, where she provided legal representation on all aspects of complex real estate and housing development transactions. Following law school, she was law clerk to Honorable Warren J. Ferguson of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit and was a public interest fellow at the law firm of Hall & Associates in Los Angeles, where she practiced in the business department of, and she also practiced the business department of the Boston law firm Foley Hoag, where she specialized in transactions with intellectual property licensing and transfer. And then we have Professor Ted Barbieri. He's an associate professor at Albany Law School, where he teaches courses on housing law, state, local government, property, and community economic development law. He directs a free legal services clinic there for small businesses and nonprofits in the Justice Center at Albany Law School. His articles have appeared and are forthcoming in the Fordham Law Review, Indiana Law Journal, UC Irvine Law Review, George Mason Law Review, Journal of Affordable Housing and Community Development Law, among many others. And he is the author of the 6th edition of the Local Government Law Casebook from West Academics. So with that brief introduction, I turn the program over to our speakers, starting with Professor Weiss.
All right, thanks so much, Andrea. I really appreciate the kind introduction. And you putting me on this panel with such esteemed co-panelists as Rashmi and Ted. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see my slides. Let's see. Did that work? You guys see the slides? Great. Okay. So my role on the panel is I'm going to give some background on opportunity zones, talk through some basic mechanics, and attempt to sort of situate them in a broader philosophical context in conversation that's really been taking place in the US for decades now, before then turning it over to Rashmi and Ted, who, among other things, will delve more deeply into some critiques of opportunity zones. So I became intrigued by opportunity zones in response to claims that former President Trump was making about this new economic development tool contained in his 2017 tax overhaul. Opportunity zones were billed as a tool intended to alleviate poverty and bring resources to quote unquote economically distressed communities. And so to understand critiques of the tool, you need to know a little bit about how the opportunity zone program or incentives work. So in particular, it provides 3 discrete tax incentives to taxpayers with capital gains who invest in geographically defined opportunity zones. So the first is a tax deferral mechanism. Gains invested in qualified opportunity zones are excluded from gross income until taxable year 2026 or earlier if the investment is sold before 2026. So for example, an investor has capital gains of $1 million in say 2022, perhaps sold some stock or real property that had appreciated over time, reinvest those gains in an area designated as a qualified opportunity zone. Those gains won't be taxed until 2026. So this first incentive sort of bestows a time value of money advantage on the investor. The second incentive is a direct reduction in the amount of tax that will be paid when the taxes become due in 2026. So if the investment is held for 5 years, the investor receives a 10% basis increase. And if the investment's held for 7 years, the investor receives a 15% cumulative basis increase. So for example, if an investor had capital gains again of $1 million, invests them in a qualified opportunity zone, holds the investment for 5 years, only 900,000 of that original million in gain is taxed in 2026. So 10% or $100,000 is not taxed. And you'll note if you do the math, it's now too late for new investments to obtain this incentive, since again, the taxes become due in 2026 and you've had to have held it for 5 years. So this will be relevant to previously made investments. Though I will note legislation introduced in the Senate and the House, the Opportunity Zones Transparency Extension and Improvement Act, would push the state out by 2 years to December 31st, 2028. The third incentive is an exclusion from income of appreciation of the qualified opportunity zone investment if the investment is held for 10 years. So an example here, you have a taxpayer that invests $1 million in a qualified opportunity zone. Say that investment appreciates by 20% over time, say over 10 years. That additional $200,000 in gain is excluded from income, so won't be subject to federal income tax. So a set of, quite valuable incentives, and you might ask, what does the public receive in return for, extending these very valuable tax incentives? And the answer relates to where these incentives are made. And specifically, they're supposed to be made in certain quote unquote low-income communities. So you can read, what the requirements are to qualify as a low-income community under the terms of the Opportunity Zone program. It's either keyed to either poverty rate or median family income caps. You'll also note that designates a certain set of census tracts. The program also allows for contiguous tracts to also be potentially eligible as designees of being an opportunity zone, so long as those contiguous tracts don't exceed 125% of median family income of that neighboring eligible tract. So there were about 40,000 eligible tracts, and governors selected 25% of them, submitted them to Treasury for certification. Sort of visually looking across the country, this is what the map looks like. You'll see there are opportunity zones spread out throughout the entire, all of the United States. Looking more specifically, I'm here in Washington, D.C. This is what our more local map looks like. The sort of lighter green includes census tracts that were eligible for designation, and the darker green indicates the census tracts that were actually designated as opportunity zones. So you might be thinking, okay, well, that's sort of the geography, but what sort of investment qualifies as an opportunity zone investment? So taxpayers here aren't directly investing in these investments. They put their money into what's known as a qualified opportunity zone fund, 90% of the assets of which must be invested in one of 2 different categories, either directly in property used in a trade or business. Think of, real property, an apartment building, a storage facility. Something like 95% of investment in opportunity zone funds has gone into real estate. So that's one option. The other option is taking an equity interest in a business located in a qualified opportunity zone. And so the program includes certain rules that attempt to ensure that this business is actually located, doing business in the census tract, and that the investment is improving the underlying property that helps the business qualify. So those are sort of the 2 options for investments from a qualified opportunity zone fund. With respect to the businesses, there's certain limits on, sin businesses, things like liquor stores, casinos, suntan facilities. Those are not eligible under the program. So that's some of the kind of nuts and bolts and mechanics, for proponents of the incentives, the argument for how the program would work in sort of basic terms looks something like this. Capital will be drawn into these low-income communities. This investment will drive new job creation. That in turn will drive increased purchasing power, which then somewhat iteratively will lure in new businesses, new resources, prompting more job creation, and so on in this sort of positive upward spiral. Communities improved, investors walk away with some additional tax benefits for taking on some additional risk of investing in this low-income area. And if you look at just the sort of capital piece of this perspective or the equation, it's, arguably maybe been successful. As of August 2022, Opportunity Zone funds had invested $30 billion of capital, continued to be dominated by investment in residential development and real estate. And this includes $10 billion in 2022 alone. So the pace doesn't seem to be slowing down. Unfortunately, fast forward to the present moment and this story that was told to sort of, support the incentives, it's not exactly how things have played out. You might have seen headlines about governors, politicizing the choice of opportunity zone locations, favoring census tracts with investments by political allies, billionaires reaping windfalls for projects that were already planned or not located in low-income neighborhoods, even though perhaps technically in an opportunity zone census tract. The Inspector General at the U.S. Treasury Department opened an investigation into reports of fraud. But I've actually argued that this sort of bad apple narrative is not really at root what is most problematic about opportunity zones, but rather that the problem is based on this sort of fundamentally flawed model that transcends political party, and it's been deployed by both Democrat, Republican administrations, and the basic notion is that mere proximity of capital will solve deeply entrenched issues of poverty and racial inequity. And so it's actually a model that's not new, and perhaps saw its most distilled version in the work of Harvard Business School professor Michael Porter in the 1990s, some of you may be familiar with. For example, in his paper, The Competitive Advantage of the Inner City, he said, quote, "To solve the economic distress of America's inner cities and reduce crippling social problems, the most important contribution companies can make to quote unquote inner cities is simply to do business there." And if you read the article, government, the nonprofit sector are somewhat relegated to playing a more distant secondary supportive role. However, what we've learned since Porter's writings is that this is an oversimplification, right? That of course business is important, even essential, but simply stimulating economic activity on the one hand and solving deeply entrenched issues of poverty, racial inequality on the other are not equivalent. So this is the conversation around gentrification in part that's been unfolding in cities around the country for decades. These are images from two places I've taught prior to DC, in Los Angeles, Little Tokyo and Venice, in Kansas City, seeing similar tensions downtown along the Truce Corridor, the historic racial dividing line in the city. And the crux of this conversation has been, we're now sensitive to the history of redlining, where communities were choked off from credit. But there's also an understanding that, new investment is important. And at the same time, this kind of central question has emerged, which is, how to ensure that the fruits of new investment accrue to the benefit of current residents rather than simply leading to increased rents, neighborhood change, displacement. You're all sort of familiar, I assume at this point, with these kinds of debates and tensions. So in an article that I've written on the subject, I cite to the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, now actually the National Homelessness Law Center, and their great report on the criminalization of homelessness. Increasingly, we're seeing jurisdictions are taking sort of punitive approaches to poverty and homelessness. We've gotten really good at sort of beautifying neighborhoods, but that's not the same thing as alleviating poverty. So why exactly the incentive is failing to do this, and sort of for critiques of the program beyond this sort of philosophical frame, I'm going to turn it over to my co-panelists, and starting with Rashmi.
Great. Thanks so much, Brandon. It's both wonderful and difficult to follow, Brandon, because it was wonderful to learn again from you just about be reminded about the basic structure of the Opportunity Zone program. And then also it was great. So what else is there to say? And really, I think I'm gonna spend my hopefully brief time just focusing on two general topics, two basic parts to this presentation. The first is that I want to talk about several of the critiques that have emerged about the Opportunity Zone program, leaving some room for Ted to follow with additional critiques, because there have been a fair number, right, that have already proliferated in the relatively brief time since the program's origins, and I would say especially brief, given that so much of it was during the pandemic, and it is also fair to argue that the program has only just gotten going, and we need to give it time to run its course and take time to test it properly, which is a fair, I think, response to at least some of these critiques. But nonetheless, I'm gonna start by just sharing some of the prevailing critiques of the program. And then I want to just take the second part of my presentation to talk about, well, okay, how can we address some of these critiques? Is there some hope, some meaningful hope that this program could actually serve the purpose that it was intended to serve? So starting with just a few of the salient critiques. The bottom line, really sort of that ties these critiques together, is the claim that's being made by more and more people, frankly, including me, that the Opportunity Zone program is really just too indirect a tool. Really, it's too sort of weighty, indirect, inefficient a tool for achieving actually not just poverty alleviation, which in some ways is perhaps the most ambitious version of the goal of the OZ program, but even also of economic development at the local level. So why might it just be too indirect, too inefficient a tool? Well, three key reasons that I want to focus on. The first is, and I'll name them all and then just delve a little bit into each one. The first is that it's just too complicated a program. Of course, it's based on tax incentives, but the mechanics of it, there are arguments emerging, are such that it's even more unwieldy, even more difficult to implement and to use in favor of the communities that it's intended to serve than, for example, the low-income housing tax credit program or the new markets tax credit program. So that's the first one. The second critique that's emerged is that really, if you look carefully at the design of the program, there's a very good argument that it's designed really more to serve investors, right, who have been, channeled towards participating in the program, rather than really to reach the lower income communities that the program was originally intended to reach. And then finally, I think an emerging critique is that the program just is not succeeding in serving in meaningful ways BIPOC communities, so Black, Indigenous communities and people of color. And in that respect, we are really missing. We have missed out on thus far and are continuing to miss out on the opportunity to use the Opportunity Zone program to start to dismantle structural racism or to address it in any meaningful fashion. So let me start with the set of critiques that focus on its overly complicated setup. So I think I'm going to do this just by giving you a few snippets of commentary and research. So the Urban Institute has, I think several years ago, maybe in 2019, captured the initial reaction to the utility of the OZ program by essentially, this is a quote from Brett Theotis of the Urban Institute, by essentially arguing that investors are having trouble even just evaluating OZ opportunities. And so I'm quoting him. He says, what we found looking at community benefit projects is they're just hard to do, period. So that's one example from the early years of one commentary from the early years of the program. A second, more detailed analysis was produced by Michelle Laser in an excellent law review article, and really supports this conclusion. So analyzing data, actually comparative data from both the New Markets Tax Credit Program as well as the Opportunity Zone program, Laser concluded that both were likely, as currently structured, to produce inefficient and inequitable outcomes, often because of the investment in gentrifying neighborhoods that seem to proliferate through both these programs. More recently, a set of critiques has emerged that the program can be used quite easily by investors, manipulated quite easily by investors to take advantage of, essentially inefficiencies, and thereby create more inefficiencies in the program, and thereby abuse the very purpose for which the program was intended. And even though this is what I'm just about to describe as a small sample size, and frankly, a very informal methodology, I will also say that in my recent research, and I'll say a little bit more about this as I progress through this presentation, but in my own research, in really talking in an interview format with community bankers situated around the country, there's just a fairly common narrative that emerges from that group of participants in economic development, that it's, again, just too cumbersome a program for banks to really be able to leverage, community banks in particular, to be able to leverage to support the local communities in which they operate. So the bottom line is there's nothing that's clearly emerged in terms of just efficiency, right? Utility of the program to help the OZ program in particular to avoid the past mistakes of programs like the Opportunity Zone program. So that's one set of critiques. Secondly, there's the emerging argument that really essentially began early in the life of the Opportunity Zone program and has continued relatively unabated, that again, the program has been designed in such a way as to help investors more than the lower income communities in which it's designed to serve. So Brandon's earlier point that such a huge percentage, I've got 97% from a study from a couple of years ago, such a huge percentage of the investments have gone to real estate developments, so that as of a couple of years ago, more than $10 billion raised by opportunity funds, 97% of that money went to commercial and residential real estate developments. There are further arguments and more nuanced ones that even the residential developments, a lot of the money went to higher end projects rather than affordable housing projects. And really the purpose again was to produce a high expected rate of return, again, by investing in a certain type of project. So what's left out? Most prominently small businesses. So again, from Theotis in a co-authored study, again, I think from about 2019 or 2020, here's a quote: "The most egregious failing of OZs to date is that very little investment is going to small businesses, the exact group of investees that proponents of that program had held out as standing the most to benefit." And then finally, again, this continuing and related theme that a lot of that OZ investment as a result has been made, even for small business development, what little there was, has been made in areas that are gentrifying, thereby producing investments in places that were already developing as an economic matter without the benefit of OZ money. And then finally, and I would argue perhaps most concerningly, the statistics thus far, of which there are, I think, still too few. It's hard to study the OZ program. There isn't enough information about it yet, but the statistics thus far are deeply concerning about the OZ program's ability to reach, again, majority BIPOC communities as well as businesses. So as of a couple of years ago, very few Black-owned businesses had been able to take advantage of OZ financing. The perceived difficulty then had resulted, there was a sort of a vicious cycle created in very few investments in businesses that were truly local, that were very small, and that were minority and or women owned. So I'm going to give you a couple of quotes, I think, from a relatively large scale study of the OZ program by the Urban Institute. Here's one quote: "The 10-year time horizon of most opportunity zone equity investments is not long enough for long-term community ownership of such assets as affordable housing, healthcare centers, or schools, causing equitable development project sponsors to scramble to put together a refinancing plan that may not work in a future interest rate or real estate market environment." And then another quote: "Conversely, the 10-year time horizon is too long, too illiquid, and too fixed to make the incentive usable for non-real estate business investments. The report also concluded that the need for the program to change included fixes to better target low-income areas, and again, specifically target small minority-owned businesses, and again, sort of divert more attention from real estate-focused projects to such businesses. And indeed, that one important fix might be for the tax incentives to more specifically and directly be tied to social impact rather than to their investment return. So in short, OZs really have, even though they had the potential initially to address issues of structural racism and began to dismantle some of the inequities that exist today within the market, thus far that opportunity seems to have been lost. Andrew, are you paying attention to my timing? Okay. So now I'm going to move to the second part of this presentation, and I think I've already used more than half my time, so I'll be quicker here. But what I want to raise with this second piece of my presentation is the question of whether, well, is there no hope? Is there any hope left? And emphatically, I think, I want to argue that the answer is no. And that indeed, there are successful small businesses, and indeed, networks of small businesses operating in many of the areas that have already been designated as opportunity zones, or certainly could qualify as such, and that could certainly also benefit from financial investments of the nature of opportunity zone financing. And the argument that I want to make, I'm sort of turning normative here, which is of course the law professor's jurisdiction, right? The argument that I want to make is that the focus of any program, such as the Opportunity Zone program, should be to find those kinds of businesses and those kinds of networks, and to really look for ways in which to channel the money as directly as possible from programs such as the OZ program, but also the New Market Tax Credit program, directly to those kinds of businesses and business networks. So here, this is my one show and tell. I'm going to pull up one picture to just flash the book cover of a book that I published a few years ago called Collaborative Capitalism in American Cities, in which I studied several of what I called these collaborative business networks, which I argued in that book stood out as a potent strategy for local economic development and poverty alleviation. The interesting thing is these networks have they're homegrown, right? They're grassroots in that ultimate sense of essentially growing up within a private sort of market environment. The ones that I studied were all in urban cores, and arguably with very little help from targeted regulatory efforts. But they were so vibrant, they remain so vibrant, many of them, and continue to be such an important force for local economic development. For one thing, because they have survived some of these for decades and continue to grow, and really been a source of long-term stable employment as well as business development. Secondly, they're local. They have developed often by developing local niches and networks and systems and structures and workers and employees that really serve local markets and local market needs. And finally, that they are explicitly businesses and business networks with multiple bottom lines, often which explicitly include the goal of poverty alleviation. So their success is defined not just by their ability to survive and grow, but also really by their ability to produce stable income, to produce living wages for local employees, to avoid issues of maldistribution and inequality. So I'm going to stop screen sharing here and mention the following, that in a review of my book that was published in the ABA's Journal of Affordable Housing and Community Development, Nestor Davidson of Fordham Law School was the one who really made the connection between this idea of collaborative business networks and opportunity zones. And he argued, in fact, that investment in networks of the type that I described in my book could be a powerful way to use the OZ program to invest in communities that genuinely need investments and that have the potential, again, to distribute those investments for the direct benefit of local residents. And not surprisingly, I agree. So the remaining question that I want to address is, how can OZ programming be redirected to support community business networks? And I want to argue first that there's plenty of room for private market actors to participate in the process of redirecting some of that financing, but there also is room for regulatory reform of the OZ program. So Andrea, flash me your fingers. How many minutes do I have? Oh, I've hit my. So the only thing I'll say then is, in other work, I'll just try to direct you to it, or maybe I'll get a question that will allow me to say a little bit more about it. I argue, in fact, that community banks can be a super potent source for translating the efficacy of opportunity zone financing opportunities into local community networks. And again, both by way of collaboration with community banks, but also by way of regulatory reform. I want to argue that the potency, the potential of these banks could actually be realized. And now turning it over to Ted, with apologies for taking a couple of minutes extra, Ted.
Yeah, not at all, Rashmi. This is I'm learning a ton just by participating, and thanks Andrea, thanks Rashmi, thanks Brandon and Khadija too for having me. Just Professor Shelby Green, see you in the audience. I see Peter Pitagoff and Etienne Toussaint and other friends and colleagues and folks who are whose work I admire, and am excited to have them as part of this conversation too. I'm going to say a couple words to build on what Brandon and Rashmi were talking about, and then talk about a little bit of research that I'm doing at the moment to look at whether or not, to look at to what extent opportunity zones are having positive outcomes, if they are having any, because if they are, like, I think we would all like to know that. One of the big features, so this incentive was sold as a way to fund small businesses, as Rashmi said. We don't know what's happening because of the lack of transparency, and that's a huge problem. So how do I think about or critique the opportunity zone incentive? I use a tripartite use transparency participation framework. So that's sort of the way that I think about it. With respect to use, what are the project what are project funds being invested in? Transparency, what information is being disclosed? Participation, who is involved? With respect to opportunity zones, there's no limits on how investors can use the funds. By contrast, the low-income housing tax credit has specific requirements, and funds have to go to low-income housing. Opportunity zones don't have that use restriction. With respect to transparency, we've both other presenters have talked about there's no, and Congress would has since the OZ was enacted, they've consistently put forth legislation to include transparency. Senator Scott from South Carolina, the sine qua non for the opportunity zone incentive, has said we should have transparency, and yet Congress has not acted. By contrast, the community development block grant has significant amounts of transparency through an open process at the local level. We know largely what's happening. Community, the CDBG program could do an even better job about trumpeting sort of the highlights that are happening, but at least there's a process at the local level for dispersing funds. Lastly, with respect to participation, there's very little participation either by opportunity zone residents in deciding what projects actually get built, or other intermediary groups. Either, Rashmi was talking about the banking industry or lenders. With respect to new markets tax credits, for instance, there are required intermediary community development entities that through which the new markets credits have to flow. So using this framework, I suggest that opportunity zones are lacking in these three areas, and there's room for reform. Picking up on the piece about transparency, I saw a map about 18 months ago. So what's on the screen here is put out by the Securities and Exchange Commission, looking at regulation crowdfunding. And the instances geospatially about where filers have used regulation crowdfunding. The notion with regulation crowdfunding, if you're not already familiar, is that small businesses need to raise capital through alternative mechanisms. So what I was wondering when I saw this, so this is the national map this happens to be from 2019, focused on regulation crowdfunding across the states. This is the same data set, but broken out at the county level. What I was wondering is there any overlap between regulation crowdfunding filers and opportunity zone location? Presumably, if we have two programs that focus on bringing capital to particular poor places, might there be something interesting to discern? This happens to be the Northeast. I'm based in the capital region of New York State. In 2019, we had two filers just north of where I live and work in Saratoga County, for just as a for instance. So just put it a different way. I was wondering, is regulation crowdfunding being successful at driving funds to the same places that were designated as capital starved through the Opportunity Zone program? And as a reminder, Brandon showed this slide. This is roughly the designated opportunity zones across the country. So is there some type of overlap between here the county level regulation crowdfunding and then the nationwide opportunity zone set? So we looked at available securities exemption information, and we couldn't make any sense over what was happening. So I think that's always I think to some extent that's useful. Had an idea, had a curiosity. And I just couldn't, looking at the data that was available on the SEC website, couldn't find out whether there was a particular connection. So we narrowed focus on entities that were using exemptions. So we're using exemptions, regulation crowdfunding, and regulation D, which is another exemption for small businesses in terms of capital raising. We just focused the search terms on opportunity zone to see what we could find with respect to entities that were using one of the securities exemptions and grabbing their location, grabbing their address to see if they might happen to be located in one of the opportunity zones. So here's what we found out. Our takeaway from looking at 2019, 2020, and 2021 data from SEC was two things. First, I'm gonna say I guess 3 data points is a trend. So Brandon said it, Rashmi said it, I'll say it again. There's a clear real estate investing focus for opportunity zone investments, and we learned this by looking at SEC data for firms that were using the search term or the phrase opportunity zone in their entity name. They're overwhelmingly the investment companies were focused on commercial real estate investing. There's 2 types that are on this slide here. One was the Gravitas Fund, which was buying up single-family suburban homes in outside Denver. A second is called CIM Group, which is based nationwide. The slide here focuses on Los Angeles. They do mixed-use real estate investing in urban core cities across the country. So these were 2 examples of 2 funds that we found. So first piece of confirmation was most of the investments are going into real estate. The second thing was that overwhelmingly the funds were based outside of opportunity zones themselves, which I thought was interesting. Again, it might maybe not surprising. If you're raising money from outside investors through securities exemptions, you don't need to be located in the urban core necessarily. You could be located in Fairfield County. You could be located in Greenwich or Stamford. You could be located in Beverly Hills. You could be located in. You don't need to be specifically in the particular zone. So that was just something we learned, and then a potential sort of hypothesis about why. Before I go, so that was the first piece of research. But it wasn't, we weren't entirely satisfied with the information that we found. So we were thinking about other sources to look at. So we turned to state corporate databases or state business entities databases to use a similar search process looking for the phrase opportunity zone at the state level. So we focused on particular states that had the most opportunity zone investments. So, Brandon talked about $30 billion. So we focused on the states in the metro regions that were receiving the bulk of that 30 billion. We went to the state databases for corporations, and here's what we learned. Overwhelming in a greater number, the addresses for the opportunity zone investment entities tended to be located inside of opportunity zones, which was the opposite of what we learned from the securities exemptions data set. So that was the first thing, which was potentially interesting. The second thing was that these firms appeared to be forming without securities law exemption, because we were able to identify what was in the SEC data set, and then in this new data set at the state level, we were able to cross-reference and notice that most were not using the exemption. A couple, potential reasons why, or hypotheses for why this is happening. Possibly they're using their own capital. Maybe they're buying property within opportunity zones. So that might be one reason to explain that particular phenomenon. I don't actually know why, but I thought it was that's sort of as far as we got so far with this process, or with this particular research project. I mention it here because I think there might be implications for residents of opportunity zones to advocate for particular projects based perhaps on the source of capital of investors. Maybe residents of opportunity zones should focus on non-SEC filers or non-exempt investment companies, perhaps because they tend to be located more outside of zones. Maybe they should focus efforts on companies that are using their own capital. Maybe there's no connection here. It's just conjecture at this point, but maybe there's more likelihood for things like improved use, improved transparency, and perhaps participation from firms that are using their own capital, perhaps because they're locating more in greater numbers in opportunity zones. At this point, I'm just sort of hypothesizing and wondering out loud. But I wonder if the overall purpose of the project is to connect improving the lives of opportunity zone residents with investors who can make that happen. And this is one attempt to get some information about how that process might facilitate. With that, I'm excited to move into the next phase of our conversation, which I hope to be a question and answer period, both across the panelists and with other participants who are joining us.
Well, great. Thank you all. Thanks to all three of our wonderful panelists. We are going to be taking questions. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Hopefully we're all way too familiar with how this works at this point, but please feel free to write in a question and I will pass it on to the presenters. I will let them talk amongst themselves as well to see if we have anything else. And as we're waiting for questions to come in, I just thought we might go back for a second and see if Rashmi can give us just a little bit more about her thoughts regarding how community banks might be employed to taking some of that money and translating it into local involvement, investment. And then I see if either Brandon or Ted has comments on that or anything else, but I wanted to hear just if you wouldn't mind a minute more on that.
Not only would I not mind, I'm so grateful to you for helping me deal with my bad time management in that way. So I'm going to be general here on the regulatory reform side, but again, I'm going to pick up by saying a couple of things. One, I do feel as if community banks could be the institution that helps to correct that emphasis on thinking about opportunity zones from the perspective of the investors to thinking about opportunity zone financing from the perspective of those who those communities and businesses who might need it. So banks, community banks are often the ones they have bigger portfolios of loans to small businesses in their communities. They have information on the ground. So the idea here certainly is to think about more specific and direct ways to leverage opportunities and financing by and through banks. And if I could, I'm going to share one additional statistic, which again is a bit dated. We don't have, I think, nearly as much current information sort of in the third year of the pandemic as I wish. But still, as of a couple of years ago, 3 years into the program, of the over 1,000 community development financial institutions that existed, that still exist, fewer than 10 had participated in significant OZ deals, having overcome the barriers, et cetera, of doing that. So the question is how to increase that number, substantially, exponentially. And the first thing is really just to find opportunities, and I think really as at the municipal level, through state agencies and others, to really support collaboration of banks in opportunity zone related deals. So leveraging bank financing at the local level, but also just introducing banks to deals emerging that may create opportunities for small business participation. And then to do so, and this is the second thing that may involve regulatory reform, in such a way as to, in the words of Ron Grzywinski, one of the co-founders of South Shore Bank, later Shore Bank, in such a way as to underwrite the underwriters, right? So can we find ways via reform of the Opportunity Zone program, right? But also by different sort of market mechanisms to create both OZ investment in, but also private investment in banks with as few strings attached, when those banks are meeting certain metrics of investing OZ, participating and supporting the investment of OZ money directly into the communities. So real capital with no strings attached that allows banks to spread the risk, right, rather than internalize it completely, are the three touchstones that I would make. I realize this is still really general, but I'm trying to be serious about taking just a minute or two to do that. And I think really involves both, again, private market mechanisms as well as law reform. Is that
great? Yeah, no, it's good. Let me just encourage people that are in our audience, if you do have questions, please do put them in the Q&A. We'd love to include them. And I didn't know if any of our panelists had any questions or comments on the other panelists' remarks. I'll give you a chance to do that. And then if not, I can just keep asking questions myself. I find this fascinating, and it's not an area that I've focused on, but I've been aware of it since the beginning, and I really appreciate all the remarks that have been given so far.
The one thing I'll say just in response or in continuing the point. So David Wessel has a great book called Only the Rich Can Play, which is a critique of opportunity zones. And one of the points in the book is how opportunity, the incentive was operationalized in Treasury. It didn't live in the CDFI fund section of Treasury. It went to a different sort of shop. And I think that was a big, I think we're seeing the impact of that, right? If it lived in the CDFI fund side of Treasury, then perhaps we might see more involvement from, the South Shores of the world, or the current CDFIs who can do impactful work with it.
Yeah, and I'd just jump in to add that I'm a huge fan of both Rashmi and Ted's critiques. And I think, we'll give a plug again for Rashmi's book, amazing book. We were chatting beforehand that we all love it. And Ted was really a kind of first mover in the field, defining these critiques and how to improve opportunity zones, the use, transparency, and participation framework, which makes a lot of sense. I think where I come from is sort of even one step earlier, which is the question of, are they worthy of reform? Is this a tool that we should be continuing to tinker with? I mean, most of the financial incentives as the incentives were originally passed, sunset in 2026. In Rashmi, I was really interested in your presentation, people saying that, it's too complicated, which is true, and removes the energy from and sort of empowerment of the local community. Unlike, say, LIHTC, where, and I'm sure we've probably talked about this, LIHTC itself is subject to that exact same critique, right? In the same sort of debate of what are we, is it necessary to structure a program in a way like the Opportunity Zone program or the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit program? Is some of that inefficiency the political price we're paying for a wide enough buy-in to the program? LIHTC, that's been a long conversation, similarly around Opportunity Zones. And I guess I haven't resolved that, and I think was maybe slightly more, in the Biden administration so far from scrapping it, we haven't even gotten any significant reforms yet. So they're clearly in the camp of like, here's an incentive, either let's let it play out, or they had come out with some ideas for reform that frankly tracked a lot of what Ted has said. But I guess I just pose that as even an earlier question than how do we reform, is there value in working and continuing to work on the Opportunity Zone program that in my view was pretty clearly a tax break for wealthy investors, or should we be thinking about building something new from the ground up? So.
And may I respond to that quickly? But then I really want to throw the question back at you, Brendan. I was hoping for your answer to that very question. But the only quick response I'll give is that, again, just through informal conversations, what I hear from at least some community bankers is, while it was worth the investment to get to know the new market tax credit program well enough to do it over and over again, and while that has produced meaningful investments, at least from those bankers' perspectives in local communities, there just isn't that appetite to try with OZ. For whatever reason, there's a distinction in the minds of that population of community development folks between the new markets tax credit and OZ. But can I throw the question back at you, Brandon? What's your answer to that question?
Oh man, the professor turning the table. I thought it was interesting, Rashmi, when you're talking and I was listening to your critiques, that it's funny that there are two critiques that are kind of in tension. There's both the critique that this was designed for investors and the critique that it's not doing enough to draw in investors. So, but yeah, when I was really digging deeply into Opportunity Zones, it was in the depths of the sort of early phase of the pandemic and all sorts of housing insecurity around us. And I argued for, look, we should be taking the billions of dollars that we spend on this incentive, as well as things like 1031 exchanges that in my view are largely also, significant just handouts to the real estate industry, and channel them in direct aid, right? That's what we need right now. And that's not exactly economic development, but, there's all sorts of arguments about how housing assistance is, part of economic development, kind of essential fabric. So that was the response I had then. I have to admit, I haven't carefully thought through if I were to entirely scrap Opportunity Zones and wanted to replace it with a new, revitalization program. I think I would take the lead of what Ted says around participation and bring people from the communities that we intend to be benefiting into the groundwork, process of building a tool. What would be helpful? What has worked for them, rather than starting with, here's the incentive that we can, throw to investors, and it might have some sort of, helpful ancillary benefit. So that's not the answer, Rashmi, and I'm sure you could maybe get to the center either way. Some of the idea of having intermediaries, and it's not to bash all Opportunity Zones. There are examples around the country that have worked, and where they've worked, I think there's been significant involvement, often from local government, in structuring the project and bringing in a lot of the players on the ground. So I think, the critique of should we be doing this or not sort of starts from a critique of the administration, and, are they thinking broadly beyond just tinkering with this, but what is their overall agenda? And I guess hoping that maybe the next 2 years we'll see more of that than the first 2 years.
So we have a couple really good questions in the Q&A, and let me just pose those for our panelists. Everybody who's asked questions says, thanks for the great talks and discussions. So I just want to pass that on. I wondered if the panelists have ideas about what state and local governments might do to leverage OZs for small businesses and affordable housing if federal regulators fail to improve the program. And they said, appreciate the idea of engaging community banks. Is there any additional things that federal, state, and local governments could do?
I mean, I would just pick up sort of where I left off, that I think there are examples, like I know New Haven is one that was trying to take a pretty proactive role in shaping these deals, rather than the flow being a qualified opportunity zone fund getting established, soliciting investments, and then finding real estate, having some other first mover on the ground, identifying a need for investment, and then partnering with the mechanics to link up with opportunity zone investors. In those cases, I think you have seen, more promising projects. So I think there's a huge role, particularly for local government, if we are going to sort of extend and keep working with opportunity zones.
Any other thoughts on that?
The one example from Wessel's book was Baltimore, that hired someone to go out and liaise with the investment community, with developers around OZs. And part of that story, at least, was the sort of failure of engagement from the federal government and from the from the last HUD administration to kind of do outreach, even though HUD didn't have the OZ. I don't know. I would love to be optimistic. I'm generally an optimistic person, and I think I'm generally an optimistic scholar. But I think localities are over a barrel with respect to negotiating with employers, and I think they're getting taken advantage of consistently with respect to job creation tax incentives, place-based economic development incentives like the opportunity zone. So I think local government, and to another extent state government, doesn't have a lot of leverage here, unfortunately.
Thanks. Another question for all the panelists, particularly for Rashmi. I'm really intrigued by the successful collaborative business networks in low-income communities. What are some of these potential business opportunities in these communities? There may not be any patterns across different low-income communities, but there might be. One potential connection between the OZ program and economic development of BIPOC communities might be to channel money into these potential business opportunities, potential areas of economic growth, including through real estate purchases, for example, by buying the property of a failing business and then turning it into a different potentially successful business. Would love to hear all your thoughts.
So I'm happy to get us rolling, but I will say, I think the original research that the empirical and survey research that both Ted and Brandon are doing really also provides rich answers to this question. So partly I'm going to answer this question by just being clear about my methodology for that book, which is that it was a case study based book. So I can't claim too much about patterns. What I can say is that there's enough research that's been done by me and others that I think it's reasonable to develop hypotheses and then look for more clear patterns. But what I can say, I think, is that in these case studies that I described in the book, and the many examples that I unearthed and knew of anyway, as I was developing the case studies, what we do see is a range of factors that I actually describe in, a couple hundred pages in the book, but a range of factors that regularly emerges across the case studies. And in that respect, that we might see a bit of a pattern. And one really important one that I hope is directly responsive to the really excellent question is that, and this actually responds to the first question as well about the role of state and municipal governments, that the more efficacious thing to do seems to be to look quite literally, sort of demographically within a particular urban core or area for the development of clusters, right, of businesses, not clusters in the Michael Porter sense, but clusters in the more networked sense of businesses that are responding to particular local market niches, rather than to try to develop those niches essentially from the outside or impose them from the top down, right? So I do think that the right answer here is to find the patterns as they're developing, and that's really the point at which financing like opportunity zone financing can become useful, as facilitated through a community bank or otherwise. And that's only a partial answer, but I'm also getting a signal from Andrea that we're getting close to the end time. So I want to pause and see if my co-panelists have contributions to that question as well.
We'll have final thoughts from each person in 30 seconds or less.
Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. It's a short time. Any final thoughts,
I
Brandon?
think you summed it up nicely, Rashmi. I don't have much else to add other than this has been incredibly thought-provoking, and really advantage of being on the panel is getting to interact with you all and hear your thoughts, and leaves me even more sort of interested in pursuing this line of research. And Andrea, thanks for bringing us together.
Sure. Ted, any last things you wanted to mention?
Yeah, I think I think we need better place-based economic development incentives, and I think tailoring the incentives to some of the outcomes that we're talking about in terms of poverty reduction is the way to go. Thanks everyone for being here. Thanks, Andrea.
Well, thank all of you. This has been such an important topic, and I really appreciate everybody's thoughtful engagement with the topic in your scholarship and on the panel. Unfortunately, we have a very limited time, but I appreciate all of you for joining us, and all of our audience for tuning in. And on behalf of the Real Property Trust and Estates Law section, I thank all of you for joining us and becoming part of this. If you've missed any of the Professor Corner programs in the past, you can find the recordings on the website, and we also encourage you to participate in any one of our upcoming ECLE webinars. You can register for these programs by going onto the main section's webpage. That's www.americanbar.org/RPTE, and click on the events tab to view the entire listing of the ECLE programs. So on behalf of the ABA section of Real Property Trust and Estates Law, thank you all for participating in this program. We hope you found it informative, and this will conclude our webcast. You may now disconnect. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you.